Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome to the InfoMullet. My name's Timothy Clancy. I'm your chief mulleteer. This is Bonky, the emotional support donkey. Today, chaos is not a ladder for climbing out of the pandemic. Slight reference to Game of Thrones and my favorite character to bash on, Littlefinger. We're going to do a couple updates today that we've now finished the forecast period we made in early March with the Wave 1 forecast. We're going to compare that and go over some additional information. So we will take questions throughout. Feel free to comment and ask questions. As always, please like and follow the InfoMullet. We appreciate that. If you want to share this video, please do so. We'll take a copy of this and put it up on YouTube with a little bit of cleanup, and we'll take clips of this. So we'll have shorter videos. Also, if you haven't yet, support the InfoMullet on Patreon, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. Mulleteer subscriptions are only $5 a month. We appreciate all the support. We've got probably about 70 supporters now, and really appreciate every one of them. So I wanted to, even good to see you, Jason, Celia, welcome. I wanted to get started with, you know, when we started this in March, we listed the 5 pandemic responses, and that was the People's War version that was done by China, the pandemic panopticon that was South Korea and Japan and Singapore. We had business as usual, which really no one did for very long. We had mobilization and lockdown, which I now call the hammer and the dance. And then we had induced herd immunity. And we're at the point now where we can compare some of these responses and begin to see with a little bit of fullness how they performed. And I wanted to go ahead and do that. What I've done is I've selected 4 representative countries and compared them to the United States, or 3 representative responses and compared them to the United States. So this chart, what it shows is Germany, Sweden, South Korea, and the United States. And each of these countries sort of took a different response. And it's just to, again, clear the chart. On the left side, these are actually daily new cases per 100,000 people as a 7-day moving average. That's quite a mouthful. But if you think about it, what it's doing is showing dynamically over time how many new cases were each day per 100,000 people, which is a key measure. But it's smooth on a 7-day average, so it's not as jerky, and that's okay because it's a long duration of time we're looking at. And the 4 countries represent these different pandemic responses. So in green is what I call the hammer and the dance, which is the mobilization and lockdown. And this is Germany. And I like using Germany because they're over 150,000 cases. It's not like they missed the outbreak or only had a few thousand cases. So it's a really good comparison of a large, complex, regionally diverse, sort of Western nation with similar privacy laws that we have here in the US, because the pandemic panopticon, which is in brown, South Korea, this is obviously, they only had 11,000 cases. They never really had a major outbreak. And one could argue that part of that is that their response was so successful, they contained it. But part of the pandemic panopticon is that it does have aspects of it which would be very hard to get through sort of a European or North American privacy laws. The other one I've picked here is induced herd immunity, which remains a darling of certain crowds that, hey, we can do induced herd immunity. And Sweden's really the only country that's still doing that. Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, and a few others tried it but abandoned it. And the last one, I kind of jokingly called it thoughts and prayers in the United States. Technically, we're following a hammer and dance approach, which is similar to Germany. But because of the lack of a national strategy or coordination, every state is kind of doing their own thing. And so we can compare now. Again, these are somewhat representative of the 4 pandemic responses. And we can look, all of these are time adjusted. So it all begins day 1 is the first confirmed case of that country. So even though these outbreaks happened at different calendar times, so for example, Germany actually happened a little bit later than the United States, but we've time shifted it so that we can compare as a life cycle. And what you can see here is that obviously the pandemic panopticon is the most successful of all of them. They never had a major outbreak. They've only had 11,000 cases in South Korea, and they've been able to contain these daily new cases extremely well and perform very well. Germany had an outbreak. Like I said, they've had over 150,000 cases, but you can see here they peaked because they went into lockdown. They put the hammer in, they built up their contact tracing, their testing capability, they put in place procedures, and they opened into the dance phase, and they've been open. And you can see here, the reason why they're able to open is their actual daily new cases remain low. That's why they're able to open. They've done the work to enter the dance phase. They've reopened their economy, and they're keeping it very low. So these two, Germany and South Korea, are sort of examples of what right looks like. This is what you want to see. This is what a successful response would look like. Sweden is kind of an oddball because they're the only ones doing induced herd immunity. So their intent is to keep it open, and in some ways, getting infections is the point. Their goal is to create a herd immunity response in the quote unquote healthy younger population while protecting the elderly. So, a pure case count isn't useful for evaluating because this is what you'd expect to see. You'd expect to see a high continuing daily total of cases as it goes through the population. The US has not performed well at all. We've been it's not just that we have 1.5 million cases, but by putting this in a per capita, we can do a relative comparison. And even on a relative scale, we're worse than all these other ones and still higher. If you think about this, we are reopening now at a higher point of daily new cases than Germany's peak. Germany reopened down here at less than 2 daily cases or 2 cases per 100,000 a day. We're reopening right now at around 6.5. And we get about 20,000 new cases a day. So we're still churning through massive numbers of this outbreak. The other way to look at this in comparing responses is at the deaths per 100,000 people. So this is now, the first one was cases, and not everyone will die from it, but this is deaths per 100,000. And again, on the left, we have the per capita level, and then we have the same colors for the same responses. And again, this chart now gives some more context. It's not just cases, but deaths. And so again, South Korea has performed very well. By the way, this is not per day. This is accumulated over time. So this is the total deaths per 100,000 as opposed to the daily new deaths. South Korea has performed the best of everyone, but again, they only had 11,000 cases. Germany, again, they had a major outbreak, but they've kept their death per capita at under 10. And you can see it's beginning to flatten out here. It'll still accumulate because people will still die from it, but they've kept it at a low level and they're using the hammer and the dance. Sweden, this is where I think, you can say that induced herd immunity, the goal is to get people exposed, but it's killing a lot of people in doing it. And that's not the goal. The entire goal of induced herd immunity is you're going to protect the vulnerable, and the people who are young aren't at risk. Well, if that's the case, their death rate is so far above everyone else, it's not even comparable. And, Germany's right across the Baltic Sea from Sweden. It's probably not a great comparison, but I put up a chart before. Even if you compare Sweden to its neighbors in Norway, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they're at 10 to 12 times the death rate. So induced herd immunity, people make the argument that hypothetically in the future, this will all pan out because Sweden will have a protected population who has been infected and been exposed, and they'll be better protected from wave 2. Well, Germany's open. If induced herd immunity is a real thing and people gain immunity, which we don't know yet, Germany is gaining it. They're back open, they're being exposed, and they haven't bought that at the cost of a high death rate. So again, I really think induced herd immunity doesn't have a really strong premise. And you see here that the US approach of sort of a thoughts and prayers is right in the middle of this and not a good response at all. We obviously have more deaths in total than any other country by a large degree. I think over 90,000, but per capita, we're not the highest, but we're definitely in the top 10 to 15 worst countries in the world per capita. So that's the sort of it's pretty clear from this that when you look at the responses, we can't do the People's War. We can't use what China's sort of draconian violation of civil liberties were. I doubt we could use the pandemic panopticon, but I've been making this pitch for hammer and dance, and I think Germany shows that it can be successful and it can use it very well, but you've got to follow it correctly. The US has just kind of done this scattershot approach, and it shows. We still have an outbreak. We're reopening in the midst of the outbreak, and we've had a lot more deaths per capita than I think we needed to. So let me pause here and catch up with everyone who's joined. Yeah, Jennifer was mentioning the UK news tells us that we can't compare to countries. Yeah, I sometimes pick comparisons that are regionally valid. Like Sweden, Norway, and Finland are all demographically the same, socially similar. Their political economies are similar. You could argue that Sweden and Germany are not a fair comparison, but in this case, we're looking at pandemic responses, and I've done what I can to normalize. Barbara, good to see you. David? Um, yes, David Merriam asked, did Australia and New Zealand do the hammer and dance methods? Yes, they were hammer and the dance. They did a lockdown very early. They are now opening up because they've built up their. Most countries that have gotten past this are doing versions of the hammer and the dance. Glad that it's helpful. Let's catch up here. Jennifer, Lisa. Yeah, and Mikhail points out there's a lot of assumptions in induced herd immunity. One, the virus doesn't mutate. Two, that we get immunity to begin with. Three, the immunity lasts for more than a couple months. You know, there's so many assumptions that we don't know in induced herd immunity that it seems very dangerous to follow that. Rory, good to see you. James, good to see you. Eugene. Yeah, there was a question there. I don't know how to pronounce that because your name's in Hebrew, but you explain why after up in Germany, there's no uptick in cases. So that's because Germany is very strong. Remember, when you open up for the dance, it's not just like, hey, we're open, everyone have fun. You have in place the very capabilities that let you see where the virus is. Remember, in the hammer, the reason you go into lockdown is the virus is invisible. It's spreading through your population and you can't see it. But as you build up that testing capability and the contact tracing capability, so when you find someone, you can see who they're touching, you're able to now see the virus spread. And that way you can identify the people who are infected and isolate them. So in Germany right now, if you're identified as positive, you get quarantined. They don't have to quarantine the entire country anymore, or the province. They quarantine the person who's infected, and they make it so that other people don't get exposed to them. They can only do that because they put in place the effort to get up to testing capability and contact tracing. And we described last week, there was a situation where Germany thought they'd have to go back into lockdown. They measure it very closely. If they go above R1 replication factor, they're going back into lockdown. And there were a couple days they were there, but it didn't hit their 7-day moving average. So think of Germany. Don't think of the dance as just a casual approach. It's a very disciplined, methodical, almost engineered effort to contain cases. They're still going to have them. People will still get sick. But what they're trying to do is prevent that outbreak upsurge. Sean, good to see you. And let's go. So the next thing is I wanted to review some forecasts we made back in March. So for those who have been following for a while, we actually, on the InfoMullet, I made a series of forecasts March 2nd or 3rd. So really at the beginning of the US outbreak, I made what I called ambiguity forecasts. And then in late March, a group called IHME, which is a data processing group for healthcare analytics out of the University of Washington, they created a separate model, and that model was very influential in the White House. So what I did in late March is I froze the forecast. I took the IHME data as of March 30th. You can see the sources up here. And I plotted it for the next 6 weeks to sort of the wave one, so we could get a feeling. And I also, here's the source of the InfoMullet ones. And how I plotted this is I put bands at sort of mental models or mental milestones. So here on the left is the total number of deaths. Now, this is total deaths, not per capita. And you can see here these bands are sort of just ways of conceiving these numbers. And these are the total US casualties for these different things. So the entire global war on terror for US casualties, not anyone else, over 19 years is down here. An average flu season is down here. The Vietnam War, all 9 years of the US involvement in Vietnam War, it's about 60,000 dead, is up here. The 2018 flu season, which is the worst flu season in the last 30 years, 82,000 dead, it's up here. And World War I casualties for the US is here. And we plotted these forecasts, and you can see there were some high ones from the InfoMullet and some low ones. And COVID, they're in the brown, and the IHME ones are in blue. And what's amazing to me is how close IHME's midpoint range. So they had a mid-range estimate on March 30th, and they estimated by May 15th, we would be right around, and they nailed it. I mean, the red is the actual deaths. So I've been tracking the deaths per day, and it's not usual you see a forecast be that accurate. And they've gotten a lot of grief, which is kind of unfair because the purpose of their models is to shift as the data shifts to give guidance to the hospitals. They're trying to guide hospital decisions like how many beds do you need, where do you need them, where does the healthcare. So they adjust their forecast regularly, just like you would a hurricane track. They're constantly changing based off what the weather is. This is supposed to be useful. What I did is I froze their forecast at a point in time because I wanted to see, well, their assumption that underlied this is that the US would only partially practice social distancing. Now, when we went into lockdown, they changed their forecast because we were in lockdown. But you look at it in hindsight, and if you look over the course of the 6 weeks, we have been mixed in social distancing. Georgia was like, coming up to the pool and dipping the toe in the water, and oh, it's a lockdown for a week or two. Oh, we're done with lockdown. And other states have reopened. Now the majority of states are in some phase of reopening. So I think it was their assumption that they built in at the end of March that social distancing would be mixed at best was an accurate assumption. And their mid-range estimate is almost dead on. So in a way, this is kind of like, let's all give a round of applause to IHMEA for getting this right, which is not easy. And this obviously only goes through May 15th, so it stops at a point in time. And by the way, note this infomullet case number 4, that's the closest one I did, which is sort of the mid-range of my estimates. But I've been tracking the daily new cases, or the daily new deaths. So this is deaths per day. And you can see here, each one in blue is the number of deaths with the 5-day moving average. And again, these little shaded areas, this is when New York issued a large revision, just to sort of explain a bump. And you can see here the wave 1 peak, and then this gradual decline over time. Now, I don't want to oversell this decline. We are still losing between 1,000 and 1,500 people a day to COVID-19. It is declining over time, but it's a very gradual decline, and we're always at risk with this reopening of sort of sparking this wave 1.5. I've said for a couple weeks, wave 1.5 is coming. I'd love to be wrong. If I'm wrong, happy day. That means the deaths continue to go down, and we'll probably crest out at around 100 to 110,000 by mid-June. But I expect those deaths to reverse and increase because we're reopening in the midst of this, and we probably be closer to 130 to 140,000 deaths. So this is the update of where the forecasts are. And just by way of that one infomullet forecast, I wanted to share this. So this was in early March that I made this forecast. It was like March 2nd. And this is the case number 4. And what we did with these cases is we took the data coming out of China and just assumed certain levels of ambiguity. So like case number 1 is that China's underreporting cases by tenfold, or their case number 2 or 3 might be they're underreporting deaths by tenfold. We were playing with the data using ambiguity assumptions and then applying those factors to the United States. So the one that it was closest to, case number 4, assumed that China's data was accurate, but instead of the cases being evenly spread across Hubei province, which has 65 million people, we said that 80% of those cases are concentrated in Wuhan City that only had 11 million people. Now remember, at the time, we didn't know where the cases were located. This was an assumption. And what that did is it reduced the infectivity rate while keeping the crude fatality rate about the same here. And when we applied it to the US, we ended up with an estimate of wave 1, 1.6 million infected, and a number of mild cases, severe and critical, and 67,650 deaths. Well, as of May 15th, the actual result was 1.4 million cases, so that was about 12% off, and 87,000 deaths, which is about 22% off. Not bad for a back-of-the-napkin estimate made on March 2nd to where we are now. I mean, this was not like a simulation model. This was just using some techniques I learned in the military to, in situations of high ambiguity and uncertainty, you play with that uncertainty, quantify it, and make estimates. This, by the way, is the spread of all the forecasts that were done in that exercise, and I called out case number 2 because case number 4 is where we're closest to now. But it's possible that we may be heading toward case number 2. And if you see it has 135,000 deaths, as I said, that's where I'm thinking we might end up because we reopened, and 3.3 million infected. Now that case assumes that China underreported their total infected and total deaths by tenfold, which, as we know, after I made these forecasts, China announced a revision of about 50%, nowhere near tenfold. So, but we don't know if that revision was completely disclosing everything or was just a partial revision. So again, we're sitting right now between these two forecasts, one of which turned out to be very accurate, that it's a very localized virus, it clusters in local areas, and the other of which is China was underreporting their data by about tenfold. So again, I like doing reviews of these because when you do forecasts, the point is not to get it right. You don't do forecasts to get perfect accuracy and nail it on a dime at a point in time. The point of a forecast is to make clear your assumptions, provide an explanatory theory of how the world's going to work, and then go back and look and say, is this actually how the world worked? You go back and review it. This is why I freeze them at a point in time. So the purpose of these forecasts, the reason I'm going back to them now is to say, all right, we've lived through this time period. What was accurate? What was right? What was wrong? I had some forecasts that were way off that assumed a 20 to 30-fold under ambiguity level, and that had somewhere between 270,000 and 450,000 deaths. We're nowhere near that right now. So I mean, it's useful to be wrong on forecasts, and the reason we make multiple forecasts is so we can understand which one had the better explanatory theory. Let me catch up with a couple of people. I'll get to questions here in a bit. Tyson, good to see you. I was just talking about Iowa fire departments today. It's a hot topic, no pun intended. Mike, good to see you. Michael Hartwell, thanks for joining. Matthew, Sean, LaDanya, good to see you. I hope I'm getting that right, LaDanya Riggs. So by the way, if you haven't become a mulleteer, www.patreon.com/infomullet. If you like this video, please share it and like and follow the infomullet. So a good question here from Guy is do I trust the Guardian with the lockdown? I've seen the lockdown reported. There's a city in northern China that's on the border with Russia that they've locked down the city. But what I'm not sure about is there's some headline reports that the city itself is locked down or the entire province is locked down. And there's numbers being thrown around like 100 million people are now under lockdown in this Chinese province. I haven't been able to chase that down to my level of confidence yet. So, and I'm not saying the Guardian's inaccurate, but I'm seeing a lot of headline reporting, but I want to get a better feel. I'll probably update that on Saturday with where we're at, because it may be that they've gone back into this people's war approach that they have experience in Hubei and Wuhan. But I want to get a better sense, because there's a lot of reporting that's sort of all claiming the same source and this 100 million number, but I've also seen that it's only the city, which won't be small. These cities tend to be fairly big, but I wanted to be sure about that before I jumped into it. So let's shift now from nationwide. In the US, one of these big questions is the state level. Should states be reopening? And I've been struggling to give good data to people. We've talked about test rates, we've talked about contact tracing, but the one data piece that was always missing is this R-OT number. So what is an R-OT number? It's R0 if it's writing down. R-OT is the amount of replication the virus has. And we've been using this since the very first articles we did on this, the mental models describing this R-OT value. And R1 means that for each person who's infected, one more person will become infected. So you can think about an R1, any value above R1 means that your virus is spreading to more people. Any value of below R1 means your virus is contained and it's sort of declining. If you think about an R value of 0.8, if I get infected, well, let's call it 0.5 because that math is easier and math's not my strong point. If I get infected and the R value is 0.5, I will only infect half another person. So it takes two infected people for each additional infection. And this is when an R value is below 1, you see that that's a declining number of cases. And a lot of countries are using R values. Germany calculates its R value every single day, and they're using that for policies. There hasn't been a good source of R values in the US, but I just found a website that went live. I did some due diligence on it to make sure that its numbers were legit, and I want to share it. It's actually linked in the sources, so you'll see it in the sources. But what it is this rt.live, and what it uses the same source of state level data that we do at the Infomullet, the COVID-19 tracking project. And what it does is it's pretty bare bones, but it's pretty neat with its functionality. This chart here is showing the R value with a red line across 1, and it's showing where every state is with a range of confidence value, a confidence interval. And so at a snapshot, and you can see that as according to the data, right now the only states that are above an R value are Minnesota and Wyoming, and they're at R 1.0 and 1.02. And you can kind of scroll down and look at this. It also has some neat things where you can look at 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, a lot of states. This is an outbreak, right? All the states, if you're above R1 in red, that's an outbreak. You're going to be expanding. And the amount you're above it, the higher you are above that number, the faster the outbreak's going to spread. And so 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, this is when the lockdowns were all in place, and Georgia was the first to reopen last week and latest. And now it's only using the data that we have available, so there's all the questions about testing and confidence and testing and things like that. But it also gives each state has an individual chart that you can click on a state, and I'm going to click to Georgia. So, and again, I love this website because you can really dig into each thing. And each state, when you hover over it, it adds when they put the shelter order, when they began reopening, and when shelter orders ended. So it gives you that useful reference point that a lot of charts are missing of when did we go into lockdown? When did we lift lockdown? You know, you can see Florida here, Delaware, and you can also change it. So you can scroll around and see this, the value at any point in time, but you can also change it to see new cases. Now, R values is a replication value. New cases is the actual number of new cases. And they've got here, again, a 7-day moving average, which is the thick black line, and this kind of spiky in between, which is the, you know, the daily reporting. And I pick on Georgia because it's so easy to pick on. They've been screwing up their data every way you could possibly screw up. Like if you look at their death counts, it has 5 days in a row of high deaths and then 2 days of low deaths and 5 days of high. Well, I guess no deaths happen on the weekend because every Saturday and Sunday the death count in Georgia goes low. But you can see here, for example, that Georgia is still averaging 580 new cases a day. And it's kind of declining a little bit from its peak, but it's nowhere near done. And you can look at some of the outbreaks. So for example, Texas. Texas has been in the news recently. Scroll down here. You can see that its R value is 0.8. That's good. And you say, okay, its R value is low. That's good. But if you show new cases, look at this. Its new cases are gradually rising. This is why you want to look at multiple pieces of information. R value may say, well, it's low technically, but its new cases are rising. That tells you that there may be that R value is going to start increasing again. And you can look at like Washington. Washington did a really good job with their virus, and it remains low and has low new cases. So Texas, again, these numbers on the right, their scales are different per state. Texas is getting about 1,000 new cases a day. Washington's only getting about 200. And you look at something like Wisconsin, where they're having a real struggle, and you can see that has spiked up a lot. This is after they did the primary. You can almost chart that primary where they went out and voted to this gradual increase. So what does this mean in terms of school reopenings? Everyone's asking me about school reopenings. And I understand why, because that's important for people who have kids. It's important as an indicator of trust in the economy. You know, there's a lot of fear about reopening schools. Well, one of the ways you can use this chart is we know now from the research that when schools are open, that adds about 0.3 to the R value, right? So you can, in some ways, you can think of the R value as certain things have an R value addition. Like maybe we could hypothetically say that bars, restaurants, salons have an R value of 0.25. If they're open, it adds 0.25. And you can look at these ones, anything that's above this 0.8 line, if you reopen the schools in these areas, you're going to push it, at least according to the research, above 1. Again, let's assume that all this data is accurate, all the testing is accurate. There's no problem with this data. The only decision is, should we open a school? And this is why this R value is really important, because you can say, if we open a school and if the R contribution of an open school is 0.3, then every single one of these that is above 0.7, which is going to be, so basically from Georgia to the right, if you open schools there, even as shoddy as the data is, you're going to push this potentially above R1. And this is why I've been saying that I don't think schools are going to open. I know people are advocating it. I know people are pushing for it. But every time, people have asked me a lot, because I've made this sort of wave 1.5 predictions. And they're asking me like, do you feel nervous because it hasn't manifested yet? Or are you uncomfortable that your prediction is wrong? No, I'm not, because these aren't exact sciences that says, if you do this thing, there will guaranteed be an outbreak. It's more like a probability. The more things you open, the more you add to that potential R value. Now, you may get lucky, but it's a factor over time. The more time you do this, the more chances you're taking, the more risk it's going to catch somewhere. So yeah, a state might be fine for 2 weeks. That doesn't mean it's going to be fine for 4 weeks. I'd love to be wrong on it, but I don't think we've got the confidence to say this is naturally going away. It goes away when, as Germany showed, when you have disciplined processes and procedures in the dance phase to manage this. We don't have that in a lot of states, which is why I'm sticking to my guns and saying, I'd love to be wrong, but I think we're heading to wave 1.5. And so let me pause real here and see if there's any questions on this, because I just went through a lot of. Sarah, good to see you. Yeah, Guy, math is not my strong point, says the simulation scientist. Funny story for another time. I flunked out of high school math and my first college attempt. I didn't even think I was good at math till my mid-30s. So yeah, I'm the simulation scientist who relies on computers to do the math. Hopefully I didn't tank my credibility there. Uh, let's see here, some questions. Yeah, I'm not vouching for every. Lisa brings up a good point that start end dates for Indiana aren't exactly accurate. I'm not vouching for every piece of data on that website because I just saw it today, but it does look like they're getting cases from a legit area. It looks like their methodology is sound. Send them feedback. Make sure they're improving their models. Uh, let me get to. Yeah, Montana's doing well. Alaska's doing well. Hawaii, if Rory's on here, aloha. Hawaii's been doing fantastic. What we saw in Europe, I wonder is happening in Europe. In Europe, you could put a line. Eastern Europe, where they didn't have as much confidence in their healthcare systems, tended to perform far better. If you're a rural area where you know you're on your own, Alaska, not that Hawaii's rural, but it's certainly isolated. Montana, you are used to being on your own. You're used to sort of, and I'm wondering if they're being a little more serious in the response. And part of that is why they're seeing better outcomes than states that are like, we'll be fine because we're New York and we have lots of resources, or we'll be fine because we're Georgia and it's sunny, apparently. I don't know what Georgia's reason is. Um, yeah, so Jennifer Dotson, good to see you. So question that comes up from Nicholas, how do you evaluate how accurate a state like Georgia's data is? Um, my opinion of Georgia is their data is not accurate, and I don't spend any more time on it. They have done a series of moves that have lost my confidence in the data. They released several charts that were clearly manipulated in gross violations of any practice to sort of force a look like a declining rate, which has gotten a lot of the attention. You can Google anything about Georgia to get charts, but charts are just representations of the data. My concern is that until recently, the very data they're reporting had this weird method of reporting it that was unlike anything else I ever saw. They took positive cases and were subtracting recovered cases in what was called a 21-day roll-off period. Now, the underlying theory is if you catch the case or you catch the infection and you're not dead in 20 days, you're fine, you're recovered. But these weren't based off reported recoveries. It caused a lot of confusion of what is the actual new case value? Is this the positive minus recovered, or is this positive? And no other country or state is doing this because it causes a lot of confusion, and you now have an uncertainty in the data. Have they corrected that data? Is the Georgia data now accurate? I've heard they've stopped using it. But so and then there's all these rumors that I haven't been able to check down, like the tests in Georgia they just do the swab really lightly. I tend to have less credence in that because my belief is the frontline healthcare workers who are doing this are very serious about what they're doing. And it's a lot harder to have a bunch of people sort of do the test wrong on purpose. It's very likely that individual workers may not know what they're doing or do it wrong or be tired, but I don't necessarily buy that there's been like a statewide order to make the test false by only doing a light swab rather than I've had 3 nasal swabs. If you ever want to know what an Egyptian mummy went like, that's a good experience to kind of relay. It gets right up there and gives your brain a good scrubbing. So that's how I evaluate Georgia's data. I don't do state level data evaluations other than Georgia though, because each state's going to be very particular of how they're reporting. So things you want to look for though is, are they releasing bad charts and having to apologize repeatedly and say mea culpa? Are they doing wacky types of reporting where they've got a new measure or a new way of counting? What is the governor's public posture? Arkansas is a very conservative state. It's led by a very conservative governor, but that governor has been very serious and practical in how he addresses the COVID versus, say, Brian Kemp in Georgia, the governor there, sort of doesn't seem to know what he's doing. So these all play into how well I trust it, but I don't kind of get into state by state evaluations. Yeah, Krista is saying a lot of people from New Hampshire saying they're rural, so they are not worried about spread. Again, I bring up Albany, Georgia, and there are other rural areas. We travel. It takes one person driving through at a gas station. The rural area relies on that gas station because it's not like there's a bunch. They go there for groceries, they go there for gas. It's the standard place to hang out. And all of a sudden, that rural area where everyone's spread out, they're all getting back together in a single location that is where the contagion begins. In Albany, it was a cookout for 2 funerals, and it spreads pretty fast. So I would say that we don't need to worry about New York style breakouts where there might be 30,000 dead in, say, New Hampshire, but I wouldn't say that rural is good enough to be safe on its own. So let's talk now about safety. Speaking of which, The rule since day one, or day 30, or day whenever Trump got around to saying it, has been 6 feet social distance. And like so much of this virus, it was a novel virus. We're learning as we go. And that's not really a good way to think about safety. So what I want to do now is switch from analysis of charts and data and states to think about how do people individually get infected, and how does that affect how your own behavior is, and what practices you either support or advocate or put in place for your grocers, businesses. And the bedrock of these assumptions has been 6 feet. It's been distance. The problem with that is it doesn't really reflect what we now know about the virus. And there's been a lot of good research recently that have taken actual cases. And so let's think about how you get infected and put it in discrete terms. SARS-CoV-2, those particles, it's estimated by several research that it takes about 1,000 of those particles to spark an infection. So think of these now as 1,000 units of virus, 1,000 particles of virus. The trick is it's 1,000. If you take in 100 particles over 10 breaths, or you take in 10 particles over 100 breaths, you're still hitting 1,000. So this is why they say the formula to keep in mind, it's simple formula. A successful infection is exposure to virus multiplied by time. And it's that time piece that's missing, right? So distance is not an equation in there. It's exposure over duration, exposure multiplied by time. So if it takes 1,000 particles to get infected, let's go through what some common things are. There's a cough. A single cough releases about 3,000 droplets normally. It travels about 50 miles an hour. A lot of them will drop, but some of them will stay in the air for a few minutes and can across a room in a few seconds. A sneeze may have 30,000 droplets, and they're traveling at 200 miles per hour. Again, a lot of them will fall. Some of them will stay in the air for a few minutes. If you are infected, though, the way the virus transmits is the virus knows, hey, sneezes and coughs are good for passing it along. That's why it takes advantage of our immune system. A sneeze or a cough by an infected person may have 200 million particles in it, right? So you're talking almost 100 million or 10 million more than a normal cough or sneeze. And these get dispersed around in the environment that you're in. And they begin to fill up the room you're in with these particles. Now, it won't last forever. Oh, a breath, people ask, what's a single breath, right? If you're just breathing normally, that may be 50 to 5,000 droplets, depending on how heavy your breathing is. Most of those are low velocity. They're not going to go far, and they fall to the ground. So if you think about general breathing, it would take, if you're standing with just someone general breathing in a very shallow way, and even if every virus ends up in your lung, like say there's 20 viral particles per breath that they're breathing, every one of those ends up in your lung, it might take 50 minutes. It's a long duration of time. But if they're speaking, that increases the viral expulsion rate by tenfold. There's about 200 virus particles a minute. Now, you're in a room with someone who's talking. It may take 5 minutes of face-to-face speaking time to receive the required dose to become infected. So this exposure over time is why certain guidelines say things like gyms need to stay closed. Think about a gym. You're working out heavy, you're breathing heavy, you're exerting. Those viruses are going to expel at a faster rate, and they're going to fill the room up. And you're in that room for an extended period of time. You know, people are in there working out for a half hour, hour. That's a lot of time to fill the room. And the problem with the 6-foot social distance rule is it makes us think that we're safe if I can see someone and I see that I'm distant. But think about that gym, right? You walk into a gym and it's empty. Did someone leave after working out for an hour, 5 minutes before you got there, and this room is now full of particles? Has it been empty for 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours? And I'm just picking on gyms here, but same with daycare centers, same with any enclosed area. It's about exposure over time. And the more people that are in that area, you could have a social distancing friendly, like under 10 people. Well, if you have under 10 people in a small room for 4 hours, guess what? They're all going to be exposed to one another by the end of that, unless they're taking proper precautions. This is why the CDC is basically saying if you spend greater than 10 minutes within face-to-face situation, you're potentially infected. And if you're spending hours in a place, even if there's few people, that's a potential infection vector as well. And this should guide, I think, better safety practices. Now, I've linked the articles that this comes from down below in this there's a safety heading, and I've linked the research this comes from so you can look it up on your own. But when you think about your own safe practices, Even if you're outside at a picnic, right? People are going outside, they're enjoying it. I get it. You need to have that mental relief. But don't think that because you're outside, you're safe. If you're standing in a small group of people that are near each other and you're all chatting for 10 minutes, guess what? That virus is getting, it's not going to expand infinitely across the entire globe, but in that local area outside you are, there's enough virus to create. But if you're just walking down the street and someone passes you the other way and it's like, hi, hi, it's a couple seconds. There's really, this is how we get smart about thinking about safety, is that it's not just a simple thing as like, there's someone and how far I am. It's about how much time you have that exposure. And again, this is without masks on. The benefit of masks, they're not perfect, but they reduce that viral intake. They reduce the amount of particles depending on the quality of the mask. A cloth mask is not going to reduce it nearly as well as an N95, but it should provide some measure of protection while you're in these circumstances. But if you're wearing a mask that's cloth and you're in an area for 2 hours and it's a room and people are talking, probably not going to be sufficient. So keep these in mind when you think about safety practices, personal practices, how you advocate for, if schools reopen, think about all those kids. They're going to breathe, they're going to run around, shout, scream. Choirs, bands, anything that's live theater, you have heavy escalation of voice, even call centers, right? You could be socially distanced in a call center, but you have people talking constantly in an enclosed room. How do you work the circulation there and make sure that those people who are on an 8-hour shift talking constantly aren't spreading viruses out everywhere that gradually fill the room? So that's some of the safety practices I wanted to get in. Kevin, good to see you. You asked, in your opinion, what is the single most reliable predictive model out there? You missed it earlier when IHME, if you scroll back to earlier, I went through the IHME model. They nailed it perfectly. Their late March mid-range forecast nailed it on a dime. That doesn't mean they're always going to be perfect, but I think the purpose of forecast isn't to get point accuracy down to a dime. It's to provide a useful explanatory theory that guides advice. So keep in mind that at the time these models came out, there's sort of two arguments, one of which this will be dangerous and people will die, the other which is not dangerous and it's okay. Clearly, the models that said this were dangerous were much more accurate in general because we've had 90,000 deaths. Now you're talking between those models, it's a range of how close does the hurricane need to hit to have it be useful. IHME, when they made their forecast in late March, they hit the mid-range almost exactly May 15th, 16 weeks later. I was off when I did my forecast in early March. I was off by 20% on deaths and 12% on cases. It's up to a question. How accurate does that need to be? It was a hell of a lot more accurate than this is no big deal, but it wasn't perfectly accurate. So there's something in simulation science that we talk about. We don't go for accuracy. We don't try and say on Thursday, July 23rd, the Wall Street will be at this. We're looking at behavior modes over time and helping craft policies. So a behavior mode of an outbreak has a policy that says we should go in the hammer, we should build our capabilities, and only then enter the dance. A behavior mode of a decline says we're able to, and we've built up our capabilities, we can leave the hammer and go into the dance. You're looking at behavior modes over time rather than a pinpoint prediction success. Good to see that Jennifer and Kevin know each other. I think I may know all you from a previous life then. And so another point on safety. The White House, I had kind of given the White House a hard time for, the CDC put together very prescriptive guidelines based on this concept of safety, the infection over time, exposure over time. And these guidelines were in mid-April. So when all the states are considering opening, the guidelines were put out for draft, and the White House said too prescriptive, they killed it. And then there was kind of this softer, gentler, more vague version that came out in early May. Well, now the White House has completely reversed, and the CDC, the links, you'll find them in there, the CDC has now been allowed to release these really prescriptive formal guidelines. So if you want to see, like, what is a good suggestion for healthcare? What is a good suggestion for daycare? The CDC guidelines are out there now. You can find the link in the sources. The problem is it's May 20th as I look at the calendar, and we're already open. So this is what I mean about you can't climb out of the pandemic in chaos. All of these decisions have a consequence. Had we accepted the CDC guidelines, which we're using now in April, states could have used that they weren't bound by it. It wasn't law, but they could have used that as guidelines to reopen safely. And it builds confidence in people if a state says, we're following the CDC guidelines as we reopen, or we're choosing not to. Right now, every state has its own approach, and people don't have any reference guide to say how good or bad is this decision making and the safety protocols. So it's good that it's finally released, but it's been long in coming, and you can't just sort of chaos your way through this. You should be very prescriptive very early. And the benefit of doing that, the benefit of being disciplined in your approach is, as I showed with Germany. Germany had a serious outbreak. They went into the hammer. They built their capabilities. They've entered the dance. They've reopened their economy. They're getting back to normal, having contained this. We're not. We're still dealing with it, and the hits keep coming. The last one I wanted to go over is the situation that just broke yesterday with the National Guard. So right now, there's about 40,000 National Guard troops deployed nationwide under what's known as a Title 32 deployment. And a Title 32 deployment is a federal deployment that supports a local state government. And the benefit of Title 32 deployment is the cost of the pay is borne by the federal government, and the troops that are deployed, the National Guard that are deployed, can earn federal benefits. And these benefits are things like time on their early retirement or retirement earnings, 40% discount on public education or the GI Bill. You have to serve 90 days in a Title 32 deployment to be able to qualify for the federal benefits. So this order was put in place in March, and it expired on May 31st. So it was going to expire in 11 days. These 40,000 National Guard, I've mentioned many times, they're helping set up hospitals or temporary hospitals and shelters. They're helping at food banks. They are the surge capacity of hands and feet on a logistics. Remember, you don't win wars by strategy, you win them by logistics. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. These 40,000 National Guards have been those logistics for a lot of states. And this is why, bipartisan stuff is very rare. Governors, Republican, Democrat, have been asking the White House to extend that deployment order from May 31st, either for a couple months over the summer or even to the end of the year. So they put in a request to extend it, and a very odd response from the White House came out. The White House extended the deployment for 24 days, and it will end on Wednesday, June 24th, in the middle of the week. Now, for those of you wondering why that date is very specific, that date is 1 day before the 90-day deployment. So in a way, the White House has just done a giant screw you, not only to the states, but to every National Guard who's been deployed for the last 2.5 months. Because if they don't make it to that 90 days, they won't get the benefit of the early retirement. They won't get the GI education bill retirement benefit. They won't get they won't qualify for these other benefits, which requires a minimum 3-month deployment. And it seems like the overall cost of this to the federal government is $360 million a month. I'm not saying that's chump change. I'm a deficit hawk. I like fiscal prudence, but come on, $360 million in the grand scheme of what we're talking about these days, that's like oh gosh, I don't know, maybe 1/10 an Iraq month. I mean, it's barely anything in the drop of the bucket for the stimulus. And these are the folks on the front line. So it's a real question of why we're not going to save a lot of money by canceling this deployment. It's not much. And we can argue the validity of a lot of these other things, but I think it's really hard to argue that the National Guard isn't playing a crucial role in surging this capability to the states. So why are we cutting them off from the states just when we're trying to contain this virus, and also making it so that the Guard members don't get any benefit other than, they've had to leave their jobs, they've been exposed, they've been at risk for their family, and now they're not even going to get their 3 months to retirement. They got to get 20 years. It's not like they're going to retire on 3 months. They have to earn a bunch, but they're not going to be able to clock their 3 months. They're not going to be able to get their 40% off public college. It just seems like another poorly considered decision. I expect it will be reversed. I don't think this is going to stand. I think it will either come out that was a draft guidance which has been finalized and corrected or improved, or it was misunderstood or something like that. I think we're going to see the National Guard extended, but it's just another decision that makes no sense because it seems very punitive in nature with no basis in the actual, a beneficial method. So someone here, Casey, is it safe for my kids to go on bike ride with his friend if they keep their distance and wear masks? Just curious your thought here. Casey, I don't know if you were here for earlier. This will go up on Facebook and I'll load it to YouTube. There's an entire section about how you think about safety as exposure over time. they're moving, and it's about viral exposure. If they're moving in a high wind area, they have masks on, cloth masks, and they're not stopping and standing and talking to each other. I mean, of course, these are kids, right? So big asterisks that they're doing what they say they do. But let's assume they're going out bike ride. They're not going to stand and see a frog on the road and sit there and talk about it. It should be relatively safe, but it's always a question. I mean, it's kind of like when you pass someone in the road, if you're distance away and you're bike riding, those are going to have lower viral exposures. Where you need to be careful of is if they stop their bike ride and they're out in your front yard and the bikes are on the lawn and they're just standing there talking or playing with sticks or whatever kids do, that's when the risk increases. So these activities, I would think about the entirety of the activity and also what they might get on their clothes. If they're riding through a crowded area, they may get viral exposure on their clothes, and now they're bringing that back in. Again, clothes can be contaminated. The life cycle is not as bad as plastic or some other things. But it's just, I try and be careful not to say, nobody go out, nobody do anything, the world is closed, but use what we know now about the virus as sort of the viral load and exposure over time to make better decisions. Yeah, Mike's asking a long question that I'll probably get to later because that's a long. Yeah, and I know, Casey. I got 2 daughters, so I hear you. It's very hard to maintain a kid's relationship over a Zoom. We worried here. We are worried that kids are going to spend all their time on iPad and Zooms, and they're like wanting to go out and see people face to face, like we all are. So, if you want to, Casey, look in the links, and everyone else. When we talk about safety and safe practices, I've included the research that describes this viral exposure over time. There's a lot of examples in there. I've included the CDC. I include these resources because with the chaos that we've got right now with the state level responses and who knows what's going on, we unfortunately have to make individual decisions. And it's not unfortunate. I mean, it's a good thing that we have this information and we can do it, but we're kind of on our own. We can't have a general safe foundation across the board and then choose to make exceptions. We have some states that are being manifestly unsafe across the board. So the exception is going to be the person who acts safely. And that's why I'm providing this information so people can make their own choices. Let me see here. Other questions. Yeah, Nicholas is providing a good overview of modeling accuracy. I mean, I can go, if you guys want an entire Ask Me Anything live about model accuracy and simulation forecast versus prediction, I can do that. I am happy to go into that level of detail, and maybe that's where we need to go. But I don't know if that's going to be as exciting for other people. This is why the Box quote, George Box, all models are wrong, some are useful. Because what you're trying to do is model a complex world. And you'll never know everything you need to know to get it right. You don't have the data. You'll never be able to replicate it because you can't test it like you would physics. You can't test a complex system like you can gravity. You can never replicate what happens in Italy and say, well, if we did Italy in one way versus how we did it, you can't do a double blind test. So complex systems, models of complex system are incredibly difficult, but that's why they're useful. This isn't easy stuff. We're talking about nonlinear and feedback effects over time. This is why I'm in simulation science. The only thing that's close enough are these models, these simulations. Let's see, other questions, just kind of going through here, taking a look. I think I saw something in here about hurricanes. I am concerned about hurricane season. In fact, there's a big cyclone heading into Bangladesh and India that I'm keeping an eye on. It's probably the largest one in 20 years. That's their version of a hurricane. These natural disasters are going to continue happening right alongside the pandemic. And our traditional response for most national disasters is not good from a COVID-19 standpoint. You think a hurricane's heading to Florida, what do? You open up I-75 both lanes, everyone goes on the road and they stay in hotels all the way up Georgia. Well, what if Florida's having a huge outbreak or Georgia's having a huge outbreak and a Cat 5 is heading to Orlando or Miami or somewhere along their coastline? If you evacuate everyone, you may be evacuating them into a pandemic situation. If you don't evacuate them, you're leaving them in the path of the hurricane. There's no easy answer. This isn't something like you say, oh, here's the answer. These are the kind of complicated things we're going to have to balance in a policy standpoint. And this is why I keep pushing on positive testing or testing rates, testing sufficiency, contact tracing, because those aren't the end all be all. they are the foundational elements to having a good, robust means of handling these things. Maybe we know if we're going to surge a bunch of people into Georgia because we're evacuating Florida, we move a lot of contact tracers there, we increase testing, and we get much more careful on it because we know we've upset the balance that was between these states and normally happening. And I think these hurricanes, as hurricane season begins, we have a few months. It's going to be a challenge, though, because the tail end of hurricane season is right when wave 2 is supposed to happen in the fall. So a lot of us are watching India and Bangladesh right now to see how they do and what happens, because they're literally facing a catastrophic situation right now with a massive hurricane, and they're dealing with their own outbreaks. Sarah, be happy to talk more about models. Stefan has... Yeah, so the World Health Organization is now, I mean, we're still accelerating cases globally. Stefan's pointing out that we had 106,000 cases reported to the World Health Organization, 1/5 of which come from the US. So this is, and again, these types of responses are going to continue to be important because the world is still dealing with this. Even if we get, well, I can't say we get fined because we're not fined, but let's say Germany's doing well. Germany has got to decide when it opens its border and feels safe, and it's going to work with countries that it feels are also handling things well. Canada doing very well compared to the US, even on a per capita basis. Are they going to want to open the border? I saw this absurdly funny / tragic quote where both US and Canadian officials are like, we're very comfortable with the border staying closed. That's diplomatic code for Canada saying, you guys need to get your S together, and US saying, yeah, we realize that's a problem on our part. You know, that's a huge border right there that we got to figure out. So any questions that I missed? I'm going to do a final again. If you like this and want to support us, www.patreon.com/infomullet. It's $5 a month to be a muleteer. We appreciate all the muleteer subscribers. Please share this video to your friends. I will be uploading a YouTube version, and then I'm going to go through and clip some of these segments so they're little bite-sized chunks, 3 to 5 minutes, put them on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter @Twitter. And let me just do a last check to make sure if I haven't missed any. Yeah, people are still beating on Georgia, which is fine because they deserve it. The state deserves it, not the people, but the state, with those charts they did. If people are looking for the links, there's a discussion. Facebook Live has a discussion where there's a post. I put all the links in there, and you'll be able to find the links that way. All the links are in there. Yeah, Jennifer bringing up a good point. Something they did 2 weeks ago has lethal implications today. That my job has always been, except for the month I was out sick with COVID, has been trying to think a month ahead so I can tell people how to think 2 weeks ahead so they can react better to people who are 2 weeks behind. Because that's really how you have to think about this virus. If you are operating in today's information, you're behind the curve. If you're late, you're operating on last week's information, you're really behind the curve. So we have to get used to thinking ahead by a lot to be able to make decisions in the future so that we're not paying the consequence for past actions. I mean, the virus, this time delay effect has been one of the most complicated things with this virus to get across and educate people on. So yeah, Eugene's saying that this may be common. That this 89-day assignments, they're part. It may be common, Eugene. I think what's different here is the scale. This is the largest deployment since Katrina, so I think this may get a lot more visibility. I think you're right that a lot of times the military get the short end of the stick. Trust me, I work with them. I understand that. I'm not military myself, but I understand they probably get the short end of the stick. I hope the size and national emergency of this creates enough publicity that the word gets out and this gets reversed, because it makes no sense. And I'm hoping this one gets reversed, even if the other ones can't be. So we're at the top of the hour, and I'm trying to be very careful with my time so I don't lose my breath again and kind of fade out into red-faced this. So once again, thanks everyone for attending. Hope you got some good information. I'll be uploading this to YouTube. Bonky appreciates it. Again, www.patreon.com/infomullet. If you want to support us as a muleteer, please share this video. And if you haven't yet, like and follow the InfoMullet page. As I get more recovered, there's more updates coming, not just about COVID. There's some ISIS stuff going on in Iraq and the Sahel. There's the Libyan insurgency. I want to follow up on what's going on in Hong Kong. There's a lot of important stories that have been going on, and I want to shift into those. But I keep thinking that with the state of the U.S., at least, that this crisis has not passed. I want to continue to focus on that and kind of balance that out. But we are going to get back to our regular coverage at some point. So thanks, everyone, for their time. If you can, stay indoors. If you can't, wear a mask, and remember how much time you're spending in exposure. So everyone, have a good day and take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.